Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, people of all fandoms, welcome to the Ferret and Raccoon podcast, episode 145. I am your one and only host for this podcast, bringing you pretty much one of the first podcasts of July. We've already reached the halfway point of 2020, and already the world, still somewhat in the grips of the pandemic, COVID-19, coronavirus, is in a very strange place given that we are both coming out of lockdown, it's easing up, and then places are going back into lockdown. It's a very strange and confusing time, and even regarding people going back to work, certain shops and industries opening up as well as schools, it's all very interesting and very odd. I hope that things start to get better in the coming weeks, although given that winter is coming up very soon, I'm a bit worried, but that's something we'll cross when we get to it, as the saying goes, I guess. But it's just me on this podcast, unfortunately. Was going to have Ace on the podcast, but things just didn't work out. That's just how things be. So you just have me for a very quick and short podcast. The next podcast that I believe I will have a guest on will be much longer because I've already have half of it planned. So that's something to look forward to. But I'm not going to waste too much time because this is a very, very, very small podcast. Didn't really get too much done over the last 2 weeks, mainly because I have a little bit of a story. I essentially managed to, well, first of all, I destroyed my PlayStation 4 controller. It kind of just stopped working. One of the buttons just wouldn't work anymore, which was quite unfortunate. And so I had to buy a new one, and PS4 controllers are not cheap, unfortunately. So that really sucked, especially when you're trying to save money. Then when I was essentially cleaning the house, I somehow managed to get, it's kind of hard to explain, a sharp end of the stovetop under the nail of my skin, which, as you can imagine, really, really hurt, and that put me out of doing anything with my right hand, which is my main hand, for almost a week. It was very hard to write. It was, I basically couldn't even really play video games for the most part. It was really annoying trying to manage and keep that, but luckily it's healed up pretty nicely. So the only thing I managed to get done was I finally watched season 2 of The Shivering Truth, which is an Adult Swim animated stop motion, animated series, a very satirical, dark and disturbing comedy that is somewhat a parody of anthology shows like The Twilight Zone, and it just goes off the rail in terms of its ludicrousness and its disturbing and bizarre nature. It's not really the kind of series that I want to describe and explain, but I'd highly recommend watching it if you like darker comedies, if you like more disturbing and abstract concepts. This second series was a vast improvement from the first series in pretty much every single way. The stop motion animation was improved, the use of special effects was fantastic, the voice cast and variety was fantastic as well. They also slowed down the pace of the series as well, which was, I guess, one of my only complaints with the first series was that its nature or its intent was to kind of just bombard you with all these crazy and weird things and just go at this breakneck speed, and they kind of slowed it down and let you understand these smaller stories and smaller concepts, which, do kind of need a bit of, you need to kind of accept them or kind of let them process a little bit further before you actually get it or get why it's stupid or get the jokes. But there were some pretty interesting and great concepts. That's the one thing I love about the series, is they often or not just have a idea or a story that only really lasts, like in terms of, let's say, a TV series, a few minutes, and they let that, kind of, last and for about a minute or so. And there are very silly and stupid things, like I know in the first episode it talks about how people would, it gets discovered that praying, to God actually gets what you want. So then people start prayer jacking people, as in they would take people hostage, make them pray to get what they want. Really silly stuff like, discovering the 27th letter in the alphabet, a letter so vast and disturbing that it changes the world, and that, as well as a lot of other ideas they poke fun at, like they poke fun at, slightly more modern concepts like political correctness, gender politics, and a few other really disturbing and interesting concepts that deal with some very relevant matters for the most part. There was a particular funny scene where it dealt with snobbery in terms of being good to the environment and that kind of stuff. So some funny stuff that kind of reminded me of South Park in the sense of, oh, is this really how you react? Because if you react like this, you're basically seen as a monster, for example. Not to spoil too much, but I would highly recommend watching the first series if you haven't already. If you live in England, I believe you can watch season 2 on all 4 for free. So I would highly recommend watching that because it's really good. It's technically just over an hour long every episode because each episode's about 10 to 11 minutes. So that was one thing I watched. Highly recommend that. And let's move on to the rest of the podcast, which is going to be very short, and I'm going to go over it very quickly because yeah, there just isn't that much to talk about. And I'm sure more things will be popping up soon for the next podcast, and the next podcast will probably be super long, but you know what? That's in the future. Let's worry about right now. And in terms of right now, we have the first of 2 trailers, and that is going to be for the film Boys State, which is a very interesting film. I was already interested in this film given the fact that it's a A24 licensed film, so it was very interesting to see them kind of be showcasing a documentary that seems to be following a rather interesting and original subject matter, focusing on something that I've never heard about, being this kind of political rally debate gathering of boys in order to kind of be the politician or be within the political landscape of you know, Texas politicians or Texas politics, which is very bizarre because you never really see children or teenagers in that kind of situation or really care about it at such a young age, which I thought was a very interesting subject matter, honestly. And the film itself being a documentary, it honestly kind of reminded me of the, I think 2002-2001 documentary Spellbound, which follows children at the Grand National Spelling Bee. It kind of had that same kind of vibe, given that we're following specific children about one certain topic. So that was pretty interesting. I am very interested to see if the series is going to explore and expand on some other questions which they don't really hint at in the trailer. Like, for example, why is it just boys? You know, why is it not females? You know, why is there's so few different ethnicity children there? They do focus on a few people who, you know, were black or of a different race, and they kind of seem to imply that maybe there was a bit of a tension, which is understandable, it's politics, between that kid and a few other, like, hopefuls. But it is a very interesting and bizarre thing, and I definitely wanted to mention it because it looks like something that maybe, you know, was first of all worth documenting, and secondly worth knowing about to a greater deal. So very interested. Hopefully this one gets a wider release because I'd be very interested to know what's going on, because I'm not really a political person or really care about politics or political landscape, but this even got me intrigued, and hopefully it's something that intrigues a few of you guys listening as well. And the second trailer I want to talk about, which was another very interesting one, is An American Pickle, which I can't remember the director's name, but I know it's obviously starring Seth Rogen, essentially playing 2 characters, or himself to some extent. And the first thing I want to get off the bat, which is kind of a negative, and I don't really understand how this works. And I mean, when you watch the trailer, like, I get it. It's a film, and it was, you know, the film takes place, or when the event takes place at a different time. But when his ancestor fell in the, you know, the liquid, they just left his body there to decompose and just shut down the factory? Like, I would imagine they would have, you know, done something with that. Like, that's just bizarre. Like, you don't just leave dead bodies there. You don't. I mean, as horrific as it is, you don't do that. But I get it. There wouldn't be a film if this didn't happen. But it's very interesting to see Seth Rogen play not only 2 characters, but essentially play off himself, which is a very tricky thing to do, which I'm wondering if you'll have the range or the skill to do so. And that especially goes for comedic timing when doing something like this. It's very hard to get down to a T to an extent, but so far it looks like it's working all right for the most part. And they're able to pretty much get away with the idea of why do these characters look so similar, because, you know, they're ancestors. So that's a nice, almost get out of jail free card. And it is interesting to see Seth Rogen also both play the straight and the funny guy. You know, obviously being his ancestor, being the funny guy, more of a normal modern day version of himself being the straight guy. But even still, both these characters come off as very reserved and natural. Like, they honestly do feel believable, despite how unbelievable the setup and the story is. Because it is an interesting, I guess, fish out of water story with, like, realistic jokes, and it seems like it's going to have, like, more heartfelt themes kind of dealing about identity and, like, living your life to the fullest. You know, I'm possibly speculating that it's possibly going to commentate on how people take every day for granted, given that his ancestor has been given a second chance at life, and he seems like he's really gonna do something with it, as opposed to his like future relative, who's a bit more like, yeah, you know, whatever. So I think that's a really interesting aspect to kind of go with a story like this, because it's not very original, you know, the fish out of water, you know, someone from the past, someone from the future, not really understanding things. But I do like how it's a slower paced film, and I do like how it's not a full-blown comedy. So I'm actually really interested in this film. Hopefully it's good. I know the director, his previous film was The Disaster Artist, and I believe he did This Is It, which also has Seth Rogen in it. So hopefully the stars align for this one. But it looks honestly pretty promising, given the landscape of films today, because not much is coming out, especially in the cinemas, and in terms of anything that would really be considered good or memorable, unfortunately. But I digress. But yeah, that's pretty much going to be this podcast. I told you it was going to be short. We were going to do a longer discussion, but obviously I can't really do a discussion with just me, especially the one I'm going to talk about, or we want to talk about. So we're pretty much going to wrap it up here for the most part. And before I do so, we have the video of the episode, which is gonna be Disclosure with My High, featuring Aminé and Slowthai. Really funny and bizarre music video. Disclosure have been killing it with these music videos of late. And a very interesting song to both feature Aminé, an American rapper, and Slowthai, a British rapper. So it does make for an interesting combination, and the music video was just interesting and fun in general. Even if you're not necessarily a fan of rap or house or dance, I would highly recommend watching the music video alone, because it is well worth it. It's basically a comedic film, and that's all I'm going to say about it. But that's all I want to say for the most part. Hopefully everyone is staying safe. I know the lockdown is, in some places, is kind of easing up. I know there is a sense of things returning to normality, but please keep in mind this virus, or whatever it is still around. So just be careful. I would say just try and stay at home for those last few weeks, last few months before you will return to work, just to be extra safe. Take your vitamins, wash your hands, try not to go outside too much, because the moment some people hear lockdown lifted, they seem to just believe that the virus has been killed. It has not been killed as of right now of this recording. It is still at large. So just play it safe. Don't fuck up at the very end. I'll just put it that way. But yeah, and I guess I'm going to end this podcast like I always do by saying I was the Angry Raccoon, and I will see you on the next podcast.